Welcome to the RE Podcast, the first dedicated RE podcast for students and teachers. Season 3, Episode 3, the one about Ramadan, Part 2. My name is Louisa Jane Smith, and this is the RE Podcast, the podcast for those of you who think RE is boring, which it is, and I'll prove it to you. In our last episode, we discussed Ramadan with Waqar, Zamir and Shoaib. Well, this week I've invited some female Muslims on the show to talk about Ramadan from their point of view. So welcome to Wahida Begum, Sanum Khan and Naila Missous. As none of you have been on the podcast before, I wonder if you could just introduce yourself to our listeners. So Wahida, can we start with you?
Hi, I'm just a teacher of RE, lover of books and a Sufi wannabe, I guess, as my Twitter tag says.
Wonderful, a Sufi wannabe. So you can search her up on Twitter at Sufi wannabe. And Sanum.
Hi, I'm Sanum Khan. I'm a head of RS, been teaching RS for 10 years, and I think deep down we're all Sufi wannabes.
Yes, it's a wonderful, wonderful practice. And Naila.
Hi, I'm Naila. I'm a primary school teacher. I lead the subjects of RE and history.
Wonderful. Welcome, lady. It's so wonderful to have you and so wonderful to have this opportunity to have this conversation. Last week we learned what Ramadan is. It's a month of fasting during the hours of sunlight, and it's one of the 5 pillars of Islam, one of the 5 things that every Muslim has to do. And as a Muslim, it happens once a year. Can I ask you each why you complete Ramadan and what you benefit from it? So Wahida, we'll start with you.
I guess for me, it's a month of God consciousness where I have one entire month out of the 12 months of the year where I get to focus entirely on God. I give up my necessary things such as food and drink and sleep right now because of work and whatnot, and I focus totally on God, and it allows me to become closer to God. I don't think I've achieved that just yet, and I don't think I ever will. But it's during this month that I just feel a certain sense of calm and peacefulness that I don't feel in any other month of the year, and a certain level of closeness to God, and that's why I fast.
Thank you so much. And Sanum, how about you?
I think the why is quite simply because God said so, which is perhaps not palatable for someone who's not Muslim or perhaps not religious at all, but it's my why. So that's always the start. In terms of benefits, I think it's a time, like Wahida says, to focus on God, but for me, it's a sort of resetting and refocusing on what my priorities need to be, both within sort of traditional faith practice. So have I been praying regularly enough? Have I been patient with my kids when they're winding me up over TV choices? But also wider things. So last year, one of my Ramadan goals was to spend more time with my older daughter. I've got a 4-year gap between my kids, and I felt that we were always doing things that the younger one could access, and she wasn't getting stuff that was just for her. So we put him to bed half an hour before her, and she used to get a board game together, and that's kept. We still do that now. The year before, we had a goal of changing our cleaning products to be more eco-friendly in the house, and I went completely nuts and changed absolutely everything. And then we still do it, but we had to swap a few things back in. But it's nice that I had that 1 month to say, this is what I'm going to achieve to be better. I'm going to figure it out, and it's going to stay with me. And so that, for me, is really what this month is about.
Amazing. Thank you. And Naila, for yourself.
Just jumping off the back of what Sanum said, it's fard, it's obligatory, so we have to do it. And I've always known that as a child. But I think as you get older, the journey of why you do it starts to become more personal. So as a child, you know you're doing it because your parents have told you to do it, or the culture and the environment around you. And as a child, it's quite exciting as well. I don't ever remember thinking, I don't want to do this. But as I got older, it became more spiritual. I started to really question, why am I doing it and why is it making me feel better? And it's a journey. And I know for a lot of people, they see Ramadan as an opportunity to start fresh, almost like a New Year's resolution, and use these 30 days to really, I don't know, do some soul searching. But for me, it's kind of elevating what I'm trying to do the rest of the year. So it's more of a continuation. And kind of during this month, it's when I'm really, really focusing on being just a better person. And it's not just sort of from a selfish standpoint, but it's being a better person for the people around me also.
Thank you so much. And for you personally, what do you find the hardest or the most challenging part of it? So let's start with Sanum.
Oh, lack of sleep. I find that really difficult, and I always have. Yeah, that's really tough. I think last year, although the fasts were longer, we were waking up earlier, and then by the time I got back to bed, I had a good stretch of sleep before I'd get up and go back to work. Whereas this year, back in bed by about 4:45, and then the alarm goes off, it's going to go off an hour and a half after that to get up and get ready. So yeah, I do find that really difficult. But I think also I find finding time for spiritual growth really challenging now that I've got 2 kids and I'm working full time. And I look back when we were kids and I remember my mum used to get up and prepare suhoor for all of us and she wouldn't go back to bed. And I always thought she was nuts. But then I'd say, oh, can I stay up with you? And it would be a categorical, no, you cannot. And I always just thought that's because she thought I should go back to bed. But what I've learned is because that's how she found time for her own spiritual development. Everyone's fed and dad's getting ready for work maybe, or perhaps gone back to bed, and we've gone back to bed, and she's then got that 2-hour stretch where she sits and she prays or she reads Quran and she focuses on her own spiritual growth. And that's what I'm finding really challenging, how to fit all of that in on top of everything else that we do. And I feel like we're in a lifestyle, all of us, where we work to the maximum all the time, don't we? Every second is filled. We constantly want to be busy or entertained. And so when someone says, now find time for this extra thing, especially when it's such a different dynamic to the other stuff that you're doing, it's not mark an extra set of books. It's think in a completely different way and have a completely different focus and learn a completely new thing. Finding time to fit that all in is a real challenge.
And can you just give us a sense of the sort of timetable of an average day during Ramadan?
So this year at the moment, we get up at about 10 to 4, quick bowl of porridge, pray, and then back to bed. And then we're still on half term here, but by the time everyone's listening to this, I'll be at work, so feeling less perky, I'm sure. So back up again a couple of hours later, get ready. My kids are still quite young, help them get ready, get to work. My husband works too, so off to work, full day at school, come home, prep dinner, having picked the kids up from their after school care, get them into bed, which gives me about 10 minutes to prep food for us, as well as make the kids' lunches for the next day, catch up with emails that I didn't finish off during the day, and then somehow also try to pray 5 prayers, read a bit more Quran, which is my Ramadan target every year, and everything else that comes with life.
Wow, I'm absolutely overwhelmed and exhausted. Naila, what do you find the hardest or most challenging part of Ramadan?
Interestingly, and it's going to sound really silly, but I find the weekends really hard. So last year, obviously, we were doing Ramadan during lockdown. So a lot of us were at home, which at the beginning was quite a novelty. And I thought, oh, yes, I can sleep and what have you. But actually, naturally, I'm not somebody who just can sleep for hours on end. So I like being up doing things. So after a certain point, I just had all this time. And yes, I could use it to read the Quran and sort of catch up on things like that. But then there is also still time available. So I actually found last year's quite tricky in comparison to this year, where I'm finding being at work is really helping me. And it's actually helping me structure my day far better. So I'm waking up for suhoor and then I'm getting back to sleep, which means I still get a good amount of sleep after that. I'm going into work and then being with the children just distracts me completely. And then by the time I get home, I just have that routine. So when it comes to the weekend, it's all this time. And again, it's going to sound really silly, but I just realized how much of my day revolves around buying food, cooking food, eating food, planning what I'm going to eat next. And now because that's been pushed to just one time slot in the day of Maghrib, I just have a lot of time. So yeah, the weekends are tricky. And then again, like I said, I can't just sit there and sleep. So I've been trying to read, I've been trying to work out, but there's only so many workouts you can do. And then your body's like, I'm tired. I've got no energy left in me. I've got no food to fuel you.
Amazing. And Wahida, what about you?
I think I'm kind of like Sanum. This year, I think it's sleep and time management for me. Like right now in school, we've got the internal exams taking place for GCSE and A-level. And because I teach both year groups, I'm currently trying to balance, and we've got like assessments happening nearly every single week. And it's just conveniently happening in the 4 weeks of Ramadan. So I'm trying to find time for my usual teaching timetable. I also am a carer for my parents and my mother-in-law. And then Ramadan on top of that, and then the additional marking that comes with like 2 GCSE classes and 1 year 13 class. And I think I'm in complete contrast to Naila, because I actually really liked last year when it was in lockdown, because I felt I had enough time. Firstly, I had sleep. I wasn't falling asleep in the middle of my night prayers. I haven't done that yet, but I do feel like it at times that I'm going to fall asleep. Last year I was reading Quran. I was listening to loads of lectures. One thing that I really liked last year was there was a lot of online things that as a female I could access. like my teacher was doing at 1 a.m. every night a talk about the Quran, and I could actually stay up, whereas this year I can't do that because I'm too tired and I want to go to sleep. And I was doing like regular walks every day, and I was taking part in this Ramadan reflection diary for somebody who's doing a PhD. And I think having had that last year where I had a lot of time to focus, and then this year having this madness where I'm teaching full time, marking assessments, trying to juggle home life and just trying to fit in prayer. I think Sanum's timetable, apart from the kids, is pretty similar to mine, where I'm literally like trying to cook, trying to work, coming back, trying to fit in prayer. And I think that's what I'm finding really hard right now. Time management and trying to slot in the extra worship when I can.
And actually, what's interesting listening to all of you is that there's a very specific experience of being a woman doing Ramadan. Would you just continue sort of talking about, as a woman, how that experience is distinct from maybe a man doing Ramadan?
I have to always be conscious that sometimes I'm speaking from a very, very individual perspective. I didn't actually go to prayers, Taraweeh prayers, the prayers that we do in Ramadan, until after I got married. Because none of the mosques in my local area had space for women. Like, I think that's a common problem. And I felt like I was missing out when I was growing up, because I would hear my dad and my brothers going and experiencing, like, here they'd complain about the tired legs and everything and the long hours, but I felt like I was missing out on that community vibe, that buzz that everyone had of going to pray together. And then my brother saying how they'd all walk out and then maybe do like a quick gathering in the park and sit and talk about Quran and then come home. And then there was me at home trying to pray, like focus and give full attention to my prayer. But like for me, I prefer being in a mosque. I feel like that helps and heightens my prayer. Like sometimes, yes, being at home, I like it. I have my personal time and I get to make the long prayer about what I want and, focus on it and whatnot. But in Ramadan, I just felt like I was missing out on that. And this year, I think that's what I'm missing out on. Because like last year, we didn't have Taraweeh last year because of COVID. And this year, because of COVID regulations, a lot of the local mosques that did allow women have said there isn't enough space. And the one mosque that does, it's like a first come, first serve. And because I'm working, I can't go sit there at like 5 p.m. and wait for the prayer time. So I think that's the main challenge that I find. But then I don't think that's a Ramadan issue. For most people, that's probably an all year round issue, access to mosques and praying in mosques. So, yeah.
And I think actually that's hopefully going to be a further episode where we actually look at the bigger picture of women in Islam. So just to put that sort of idea in people's head, that'll be a lovely thing to discuss later on. Yeah. Naila, how about you? How for you as a female Muslim is Ramadan different?
I think with questions like that, it's really important to take into account people's cultural backgrounds, because for us, we'll all have different cultural backgrounds, but we're also all in Britain. So there will be differences there to consider. So I just think about sort of my family who are in Algeria, and I know that for them, for the women and the men, the experience is completely different compared to here. And sometimes I remember being younger, being like quite jealous of the women in Algeria, because yes, they would be the forefront runners for the preparing of the meals and what have you. But then once the meal is over, and it'll be the case for a lot of North African and Middle Eastern countries, after that, people go out. So there is life after iftar. So there will be like fairs, people go out to the beaches, people meet up with one another, and that's including the women. So it's kind of like an event. People are getting ready, they're getting dressed up and what have you. Whereas here, it's completely different. Like we were just saying, I'm waking up and I'm having suhoor in like 10 minutes because I want to get back to sleep because I know I've got to wake up for work. So I think that would be the major difference culturally. As a woman in Britain, I think similar to Wahida, our mosque experiences will be very different. And I think as well, as somebody who doesn't have children, I always remembered going to the mosque in the women's section and always feeling a bit overwhelmed, but in the wrong way, just because it felt a bit like it was all the women and all the children were, I don't like to use this word, but dumped into a room. As opposed to it being a spiritual and calming experience, it was more just a babysitting service almost, and that was quite off-putting. And obviously as a teenager and sort of a young adult, it was really off-putting because I thought, well, there's this big age gap and difference that I can't relate to what's going on in this room right now. So it did put me off going. But then obviously as I got older, I understood why the women were there with their children. Not to say that I agree with why they are there with their children, but it's also not their fault. And it's systemic. It's been built in to be like that, which again, I think is quite different to, and again, I can only speak from North African or a Middle Eastern perspective. I know that'll be different in the mosques there. So I think it's just something that we need to really revisit and look at, because there are children, and if you look at things like TikTok and social media, there are young adults, teenagers even, who are on their deen, they are on their religion, and we could make spaces in mosques for young people and for children and for women and for the men, and it would work seamlessly and it would be really beautiful. But I don't know if I'm just dreaming right now. I'm going to have to do some kind of manifestation and dua for that to happen, but it's possible.
It does happen though. Sorry to jump in, but like when I went to Malaysia, the mosques were literally like this massive open space, and it was just children, young people, and I remember like the kids were running around, and the imam, I said to him like, oh, is that okay? Because literally they were running where the men were praying and just seeing kids, and he was like, what is a mosque without the youth? And I was like, that's such a beautiful thing to say. Sorry that I jumped in, but just thought.
Wahida, I think that's a really lovely point to make, to say that actually there is this model and people have made it work. And so there's no reason why it can't work somewhere else. Sanum, I mean, you've got quite a unique experience as a mother. So just what's your sort of unique perspective on being a female Muslim completing Ramadan and also as a mother?
I think riding on the back of both what Wahida and Naila have said, actually. So I think Wahida's touched on something quite important about sometimes feeling lonely and sometimes needing alone time. And I think in Ramadan particularly, alone time is really important, because I feel like I wake up and I'm just doing everything for everybody. And I'm sure my husband feels exactly the same way in Ramadan when he's trying to get to work and drop the kids off and, you know, make sure they've got their drinks bottles and PE kits and the such like just as much as I am, and do the ironing because I don't do any of that. And so I'm sure he's got similar feelings about this. But on an ordinary day, I might have days or times where I'm saying, don't talk to me for the next 2 hours, guys. I'm going to have a Radox. Don't talk to me. I'm going to read a book. And I can have that alone time. Whereas in Ramadan, I think, like Wahida says, if you can have that connection in a mosque, you can have that with others, and you almost have that time to focus on yourself, but it's not lonely. Whereas in Ramadan, I think for a lot of women, it's actually that alone time is just lonely time, because you just think, this is time where I could be connecting with God. This is time where I could be strengthening my relationship with my faith, with people around me. And I'm actually just needing to switch off instead because I'm just so tired. So there's a balance there that needs to be thought about. But I think what you guys are talking about in terms of the system of a mosque and the multi-generation as well as gender engagements with it, I do think we're starting to see change. And I think the next generation will be different. The majority of Muslims in Britain today have got South Asian heritage, I think. And so if we look at cultural norms and how mosques have worked in South Asian communities, we can see why the mosques have worked the way they have in Britain up until this point. But I do think things are changing. And, you know, if I think back to how we celebrated Eid when we were kids, we didn't get Christmas presents because that was a Christian thing, but we got a bit of money on Eid and Dad would take us to the toy shop because that was a Muslim thing. Whereas now that's becoming more difficult because Christmas has become far more now than I think it was 20 years ago, perhaps, just a British thing. It's just a thing that everyone's got a tree, everyone's got lights. You don't need to believe in Jesus. Who doesn't want an advent calendar? So me as a parent, having that distinction between engagement with Christmas and engagement with Eid is very different. So, for example, my kids make Ramadan hampers for our neighbours. My daughter's just joined a new school, very few Muslims there, so she's made herself a little poster and she's taken in a box of dates to share with her class because she'd like them to learn a bit about what she's doing this month. We decorate the house on Eid. They have lists of things that they want for Eid. They get involved in charity. My daughter understands the concept of giving things up. So when we were kids, you just didn't fast because you're a kid. Whereas she's tried staying silent for half a day, which has been bliss for me, obviously, and things like that. And I think that more positive engagement with the identity has become more important. And lots of wider research talks about this as well, that, you know, Muslim is a racialized term. And if we look in the mass media and the wider perceptions of what that means, it's not very positive. And so as parents of my generation, this idea of instilling a really positive connection with that identity is then really important. So I think naturally, like Naila says, I mean, I'm not cool enough to be on TikTok and such like, so I'll take your word for that one. There is a real movement of young people really wanting to have this positive engagement and this real ownership of their Muslim identity and their engagement with the practices as well as just the labels. And I think we are going to see change there. And that's what I hope for my kids. And the excitement that they have about getting involved with it already suggests that we're on a good path for that to happen.
You mentioned Eid there, and I think it'd be really nice now just for you to all talk about your sort of individual way that you celebrate Eid. So what is Eid? How do you personally celebrate it? We'll start with Wahida.
So there's 2 Eids, and the Eid that we celebrate at the end of Ramadan is Eid al-Fitr, and it's essentially celebrating the breaking of the fast and the end of Ramadan, and I'm sure that others can add on to that as well. As a child, I have like the fondest memories of Eid because I used to live in the council estate, and we had like non-Muslims, Muslims who lived in the block, like we had like 30 or 40 families, and on Eid the ritual was literally, and we would go to a certain house in a certain order every time and pick up like money, because there weren't Eid gifts, it was money. And it was literally like a big family, because a lot of us didn't have like our immediate relatives here. Like my dad's brothers and sisters and my mom's brothers and sisters were all in Bangladesh. So they became kind of like a surrogate family. So we'd go to like, we used to call them number 1 auntie, number 5 auntie, because we couldn't call them by their names and everyone's an auntie. And that tradition has kind of continued, except now that we're slightly older and I don't live with my parents and all of us have gotten married and moved out, we all congregate at mum and dad's house, and then we slowly like we'll drift off to this person's house and this uncle's house, and like we'll do the rounds. So my Eid is literally, we do Eid prayer in the morning, and thankfully this is one thing that's changed as I've grown up. Eid in the park, like it's a really big thing to go to Eid in the park, and it's like a family event and there's a fair and everything. So we'll go there, the kids will have fun, we'll pray, we'll listen to a sermon, and then we'll make our way to my mum and dad's house where mum will make traditional food, because Eid is not Eid unless mum has made like rice flour chapatis. It's like a very Bengali thing. And curry, and then we'll split off and go visit all of our cousins. And then I think we always randomly end up at one specific uncle's house in the evening, and that's when we splinter off then. So Eid is like, for me, it's family. It's all about catching up with my family, spending time with family, because especially after I got married, there was a lot of family members that I wouldn't see, because then I had to like split my time between my in-laws side and my mom's side. So Eid is that one time when I literally get to see everybody in my family and just like catch up with everyone and see how they're doing. So for me, Eid is like family time.
Amazing. Oh, it sounds so great. Naila, how about you?
I think I'd mirror what Wahida was saying, and it's very family orientated. My biggest memories, again, as a child is going to the local mosque, and again, bringing in that cultural aspect. It was very much dominated by the North African and the Middle Eastern culture. So even though I don't live, or rather lots of those families don't live in their cultural backgrounds or their countries, we all became one big family on that day. So regardless of the border of the country that your family were from, on Eid you were just family. And, you know, in the mosque you would be greeting everybody regardless. There'd also be Zakat al-Fitr, so that's giving charity on that day as well. And even as a child, obviously it's exciting because you're no longer fasting, and, you know, there's that sort of fun game where you're like, ooh, I feel like I should be fasting, but I'm not, kind of thing. And every time you go to put food to your mouth, you're like, should I be doing this? But it's all good, it's fine. But as an adult, I think it's just changed in the fact that it's more like, I don't want to say anticlimactic, but you kind of, it's like all that exhaustion of the month, and not in a negative way because it's been an amazing month, but all that exhaustion just comes to a head on Eid and you are just really tired. So it's more of a day of just relaxing. So after you've done your Eid prayers and you've seen your family and what have you, I don't know if it's just me being boring, but I just want to relax and I just want to be around the people that I really care about and that I really love, and maybe scroll through now social media and watch some funny videos.
Yes. And Sanum, you've talked a little bit about your experience of Eid, but is there anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think I'd just say that the way that Eid is celebrated, it for me is a real marker of the fact that Islam is so not frozen in time. And we've heard about different cultural perspectives. You know, I remember being younger and doing the rounds and knowing which aunties were going to give you a fiver and which were going to slip you a sticky toffee. And we judged that. So if mum say, oh, we're going to Auntie So-and-so's, do you want to come? And I'd be like, is she a fiver auntie or is she a rubbish toffee auntie? And that's how I decide if I'm coming or if I'm staying home and eating more kebabs. But the idea that it's not fixed in time, you know, the way that my kids celebrate Eid now is so different because, one, I guess, we're more affluent than our parents were. If you think about South Asian generations, of course, we're more affluent than our parents were. So I can afford to buy some decorations, or I can afford to buy them Eid gifts. But also just their entire experience in life is very different. You know, I went to university in Nottingham, incredibly multicultural university, and Eid prayer, there would be women handing out sweets straight after the prayer had finished. And I was like, I've never done this before, but yeah, I'll have some. And apparently this is quite traditional in other parts of the world, in Malaysia, particularly in North Africa, where handing out sweets is really normal. And I was like, oh, I've never done that before. Let's do that now. And I really like the idea that it's not a fixed in time thing. You know, that Eid prayer is the be all and end all for me. And as we've sort of grown up and I'm married, my brothers are married, and the new members of the family bring in traditions and things that they've done in their family, we've been like, oh, cool, let's do that too. Or yeah, let's try that out. And I do remember one Eid where Mum tried to make rice without meat in it, which for us, we only ever have on Eid. And I was a bit like, listen, there's a line. I'm all for adapting family norms when people get married and, you know, inclusivity and blah, blah, blah. But there is a line, and do not cross it. That is the line. Do not cross it. To the point where I don't even make that rice. Like, that is your thing. I will not learn that. That is your thing. You can never die. You will make that rice for every Eid until I die. But generally speaking, I love the idea that it's not fixed in time, and it's, you know, that idea of the Muslim identity is what really brings people together at that time. Not the Pakistanis in the mosque are doing this for Eid, and the Bengalis are doing this, and the Algerians are doing this. It's no, actually just all Muslims are together, and you're celebrating Eid for the sake of Eid, and it's that Muslim identity that's bringing you together, and everything else just falls by the wayside, really.
Yeah, and just to emphasize that Muslim identity idea as well, it's also considering all the different schools of thought within Islam. So on Eid, regardless of what day you start celebrating, whether it's the day after, day before, what have you, we're all Muslims, so it doesn't matter if you're Sunni, Shia, etc., etc. It's just Eid, which I think is really, really beautiful.
I don't know if you use the word Umar, if you have a different word.
Yeah.
Because that seems to be quite gender specific, because it refers to brotherhood, which is quite male orientated. But Islam does celebrate the community of Muslims around the world. You know, whether that's Ramadan or Eid or going on Hajj, that sense of equality and brotherhood is Ummah, the community of Muslims around the world, is, I think, a model for non-Muslims as well, that I don't think exists maybe as much. What I'd like to do is just your sort of final thoughts. If there's anything you'd like to say on the topic of Ramadan or Eid or the sort of role of women, or sort of a final thought that you'd like to leave our listeners with. So let's start with Naila.
I think it's just kind of going back to the roots and back to the basics, that Ramadan is when the Quran was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and it's mentioned numerous times in the Quran. And maybe it's not the attractive thing to talk about, it's not the headline to talk about, because we're not talking about food and clothing and music and what have you, but it is the essence of why we have Ramadan and why we fast and why it's fard. And just, yeah, the fact that it's mentioned multiple times, especially in Surah Al-Baqarah, where it says شهر رمضان الذي أنزل فيه القرآن هدى للناس, which is basically the Quran was revealed as a guidance for the people. And that's what we were talking about earlier. It's people use Ramadan as a way to start something new, maybe have a better habit, or just reevaluate what they're doing as a guidance to continue for not just the year, but for the rest of their lives, hopefully.
Amazing. Thank you. And Wahida?
Do you know what? I think pretty much what Naila said, in the sense that both Sanum and Naila were saying earlier how we fast because it's fard. And I think sometimes in this day and age, we get really caught up in trying to explain why we have to do certain things. And the one thing that my teacher once said to me, he said, it's not a bad thing to just say, well, God tells us to do that. You know, because that is essentially like everything I do, even the way I treat my parents, the way I treat people around me, the way I try to control my speech, is not just Ramadan, but literally everything I do is because I believe God's told me to do certain things, like not to shout at my parents, God forbid, not that my mother would let me live after that, but everything I do is about God, and it's because God has commanded me to do that. Would I have necessarily given up food and water for 17 hours if God hadn't told me to? I don't think so, because I love my food. So it is that, and I think it's trying to remember that in this day and age when we have these sort of questions coming at us, just to go back to the basics like Naila said, and just reminding ourselves that, you know, the Quran is the source of our guidance. This is the month where it was revealed. And to have confidence, because I remember growing up, post 9/11 especially, feeling like I had to justify why I was wearing hijab, why I was doing certain things, because it wasn't the done thing to say, well, God told me to do that. And especially at uni, where everything was questioned and challenged. And I think it's just going back to that and reminding myself and everybody else that, you know, it's okay. You can just say that. And if somebody else doesn't like that, well, you know, it doesn't always have to be flowery and really like elaborate explanations. Like, I loved it when Sanum said that at the start, you know, it's fine and that's it.
And actually that submission to the will of Allah, it counters the ego. So I think all of us can understand that. And actually fasting has been part of human history for so long.
Yeah.
And there's so many health benefits for it. So it would make sense if there was a God that he would direct us to do things that were beneficial for us. I totally agree. And Sanum, just our final thoughts from you.
I think really just this idea that it's not just about the food. Most questions I get asked are just about the food. What, not even water? So 30 days straight.
That should be on a t-shirt, Sanum.
Shouldn't it? Yeah. Carry it around on a clipboard. 30 days straight. But don't you just feast loads when you're done? Do you lose weight? Do you put on weight? You know, like, these questions are not questions in my head. I don't think, oh yeah, Ramadan's coming, I'm going to lose half a stone, or Ramadan's coming, I'm going to put on half a stone. Those questions are never things that are in my mind. The food is like the afterthought to everything. Although it does always surprise me that my food shopping is often more expensive in Ramadan. I think I'm doing it wrong. So I don't know how that's happening. I don't know how I'm spending more money on food when I'm eating less of it. But yeah, just that it's not really about the food. And the lived experience is everything else that the month brings, that Wahida and Naila have talked about so well. That's really what the month is about from a lived experience perspective. And yes, of course, the not eating food and the what have you is all important because it's the necessary components. But the spiritual growth and the resetting and the setting new goals, that I think for me and for most Muslims that I talk to is really the be all and end all of what the month's about.
And I think, sorry, just to jump on what Sanum was saying, it's also being honest. Like, there are people who find Ramadan really difficult, and that's okay. And some people who don't look forward to Ramadan, and that's okay. It's just considering everybody's situation and their background, because as magical as it is for lots of people, for others, Ramadan can be really testing on their mental health. Maybe they have eating disorders and what have you. And actually, it's going back to that idea of ummah and community, and we need to really look out for one another. And if somebody isn't fasting, you know, don't jump to conclusions as to why they're not. Maybe help them instead.
Yeah. And actually that fits in with the idea that Allah is merciful and compassionate. And he sees intention, that niyat, you know, that he knows everybody and knows their circumstances and knows their reasons for struggling with Ramadan and will be compassionate and gracious towards that. What a lovely way to end and a positive way to end. Sanum, Wahida, Naila, it's been so delightful. Thank you so much for giving up your time to be on the RE podcast.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Louisa Jane Smith, and this has been the RE podcast, the podcast for those of you who think RE is boring, which it is. We just proved it. But thank you so much for listening to us bore the life out of you.